Indigenous rights are those rights that exist in recognition of the specific condition of the indigenous peoples. This includes not only the most basic human rights of physical survival and integrity, but also the preservation of the land, language, religion, and other elements of cultural heritage that are a part of their existence as a people. This can be used as an expression for advocacy of social organizations, a former part of the national law in establishing the relation between a government and the right of self-determination among the indigenous people living within its borders, or in international law as a protection against violation by actions of governments or groups of private interests. Definition and historical background. The indigenous rights belong to those who, being indigenous peoples, are defined by being the original people of a land that has been conquered and colonized by outsiders. Exactly who is a part of the indigenous peoples is disputed, but can broadly be understood in relation to colonialism. When we speak of indigenous peoples, we speak of those pre-colonial societies that face a specific threat from this phenomenon of occupation, and the relation that these societies have with the colonial powers. The exact definition of who are the indigenous people and the consequent state of rights holders varies. It is considered both to be bad to be too inclusive as it is to be non-inclusive. In the context of modern indigenous people of European colonial powers, the recognition of indigenous rights can be traced to at least the period of Renaissance, along with the justification of colonialism with a higher purpose for both the colonists and colonized. Some voices expressed concern over the way indigenous peoples were treated and the effect it had on the societies. The issue of indigenous rights is also associated with other levels of human struggle, due to the close relationship between indigenous peoples' cultural and economic situations and their environmental settings. Indigenous rights issues are linked with concerns over environmental change and sustainable development. According to scientists and organizations like the Rainforest Foundation, the struggle for indigenous peoples is essential for solving the problem of reducing carbon emission, and approaching the threat on both cultural and biological diversity in general. Representation, the rights, claims and even identity of indigenous peoples are apprehended, acknowledged and observed quite differently from government to government. Various organizations exist with charters to, in one way or another, promote indigenous aspirations, and indigenous societies have often banded together to form bodies which jointly seek to further the communal interests. International organizations. There are several non-governmental civil society movements, networks, indigenous and non-indigenous organizations whose founding mission is to protect indigenous rights, including land rights. These organizations, networks and groups underline that the problems that indigenous peoples are facing is the lack of recognition that they are entitled to live the way they choose, and lack of the right to the lands and territories. The mission is to protect the rights of indigenous peoples without states imposing their ideas of development. These groups say that each indigenous culture is differentiated, rich of religious belief systems, a way of life, subsistence and arts, and that the root of problem would be the interference with the way of living by states' disrespect to the rights, as well as the invasion of traditional lands by multinational corporations and small businesses for exploitation of natural resources. United Nations. Indigenous peoples and their interests are represented in the United Nations primarily through the mechanisms of the Working Group on Indigenous Populations. In April 2000, the United Nations Commission on Human Rights adopted a resolution to establish the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues as an advisory body to the Economic and Social Council with a mandate to review indigenous issues. In late December 2004, The United Nations General Assembly proclaimed 2005 to 2014 to be the second international decade of the world's indigenous people. The main goal of the new decade will be to strengthen international cooperation around resolving the problems faced by indigenous peoples in areas such as culture, education, health, human rights, the environment, and social and economic development. In September 2007, after a process of preparations, discussions and negotiations stretching back to 1982, the General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The non-binding declaration outlines the individual and collective rights of indigenous peoples, as well as the rights to identity, culture, language, employment, health, education and other issues. 4 nations with significant indigenous populations voted against the declaration: the United States, Canada, New Zealand and Australia. All 4 have since then changed their vote in favor. 11 nations abstained: Azerbaijan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Burundi, Colombia, Georgia, Kenya, Nigeria, Russia, Samoa and Ukraine. 34 nations did not vote, while the remaining 143 nations voted for it. ILO 169 ILO 169 is a convention of the International Labour Organization. Once ratified by a state, it is meant to work as a law protecting tribal peoples' rights. There are 22 physical survival and integrity, but also the preservation of the land, language and religion rights. The ILO represents indigenous rights as they are the organization that enforced instruments that deal with indigenous rights exclusively. Definition and historical background. The indigenous rights belong to those who, being indigenous peoples, are defined by being the original people of a land that has been invaded and colonized by outsiders. Exactly who is a part of the indigenous peoples is disputed, but can broadly be understood in relation to colonialism. When we speak of indigenous peoples, we speak of those pre-colonial societies that face a specific threat from this phenomenon of occupation, and the relation that these societies have with the colonial powers. The exact definition of who are the indigenous people, and the consequent state of rights holders, varies. It is considered both to be bad to be too inclusive as it is to be non-inclusive. In the context of modern indigenous people of European colonial powers, the recognition of indigenous rights can be traced to at least the period of Renaissance, along with the justification of colonialism with a higher purpose for both the colonists and colonized. Some voices and trees that ratified the Convention 169 since the year of adoption in 1989: Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Central African Republic, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Denmark, Dominica, Ecuador, Fiji, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, Nepal, Netherlands, Nicaragua, Norway, Paraguay, Peru, Spain and Venezuela. The law recognizes land ownership, equality and freedom, and autonomy for decisions affecting indigenous peoples. Organization of American States. Since 1997, the nations of the Organization of American States have been discussing draft versions of a proposed American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The draft declaration is currently one of the most important processes underway with regard to indigenous rights in the Americas, as mentioned by the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs.